Well, we're gathering a pressing throng. Sure. Whenever you want to start. I guess I'm on, right? Am I on? Yes. Okay, good. I'm not sure I need a big microphone this morning. You can hear me. Today and in the next two sessions, we'll be looking at that brief period of biblical history that was the United Kingdom. And as I prepared this, I increasingly got the feeling that I bit off more than I can chew in 3 weeks. That such a thing ever existed at all, a United Kingdom, is a bit of a marvel in itself. Within perhaps less than a generation, the scattered, historically diverse, loosely related Hebrew tribes of the hill country of Canaan were transformed into united people. And by the latter part of the 11th century BC, there emerged an Israelite monarchy that at one point exercised sovereignty on both sides of the Jordan, from the Euphrates in the north of southern Iraq to the Brook of Egypt, or the Gulf of Aqaba, which is one leg of the northern Red Sea, to the south. An area that included such historic and persistent enemies as the kingdoms of Amalek, Edom, Moab, Ammon, even Damascus or the Arameans. This spectacular achievement, involving what amounted to really a complete reversal of roles for the Hebrew people, is generally credited to David, who defeated Israel's enemies and extended the boundaries of that infant kingdom to imperial proportions, and established a dynasty that continued virtually uninterrupted for over 400 years. So commanding is the figure of David that the achievements of Saul almost pale into insignificance, and the splendor of Solomon seems but a footnote. As I hope we'll see that the reasons for David looming so large in the biblical and in Christian traditions are more theological than historical. Without the substantial accomplishments of Saul, the ill-fated Saul, there could have been no David. Without the political acumen of Solomon, also named Jedediah incidentally, the united monarchy would have ended long before it did, and the history of Israel, not to mention the fate of the throne, would have been vastly different. The problem is the story is long and complicated in the biblical record, and if I were to give you a blow-by-blow account of how and when and why all this happened, we would need at least 3 months rather than 3 Sundays. So what I'm going to try to do in these weeks is to give a general portrayal and perhaps a bit of an understanding of what kind of men and times these were. I'm assuming a familiarity with a lot of the stories on your part. But I doubt if many people, and certainly I'm one of them, could put that all together in a complete, comprehensible narrative. But I'm going to try to do that. My nose will be in my notes a lot of the time to keep it straight, especially the part with Saul and the Philistines back and forth. So maybe that's too large a task and too much to hope for, but we're going to try. Now, for sources mostly biblical, books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st Kings, which are part of what scholars call the Deuteronomic history, which includes Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And then also we'll use 1st Chronicles, part of the Chronicler, which includes 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, these come centuries after the events actually took place. The Deuteronomic historian was compiled probably during the Babylonian exile, and the chronicler during the Persian time, with what it said, 336 BC to the time of Alexander the Great, or 536 BC, I'm sorry, to the time of Alexander the Great. But they obviously relied on sources, and some of those sources had to have been contemporary with the events themselves. We'll also, at least I won't cite it every time, but be a little bit informed by the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus and by biblical archaeology, though I've ruled out showing all kinds of slides of archaeological digs because of time, and a lot of those digs were done in the days of black and white photography, and they're hard to get on the computer screen in any recognizable form. I'm going to use a map. If I could have a map, it'll be here in a second. Map. There's a map. Well, that's a big one. That sort of helps me with my thinking and getting things together a little bit. If I can get there it is, my clicker working. Now, I've got an essential trimmer in my hand, so I can't get that too well. But anyway, to get the lay of the land, the Philistine area, a league of 6 cities, and roughly in this area down here, the Canaanites largely occupied the cities of the plains and the foothills. The Hebrews primarily in the high ground, both sides of the Jordan River and in Transjordan, and then these other petty kingdoms. The Amalekites aren't on here, but they're to the south, Edom down here, Moab, Ammon, and then way up north, Damascus, the Aramean, will later to become the Syrian kingdom. Now, we should recognize that also this area from Dan to Beersheba, Dan is right up there north of Lake Hula, right in there, Beersheba down here, roughly about the size of the state of Vermont. Put that in perspective for the whole biblical drama. That's not much. And for most of the time, Israel, along with the other petty states here, most of their history, they were a military, political, and economic football kicked between the superpowers of the day. Egypt to the south and southeast, the Mesopotamian powers to the north, or south and southwest, Mesopotamian powers to the north and northeast. And then also in here is Phoenicia, right up here, which became a maritime power. Not so much a military power. They had these ships of Tarshish being an old name for the southern coast of Spain, southern and western area of Spain, that could ply the entire Mediterranean Sea. And they played an important part in the development of the United Kingdom. Well, we'll start with Saul. Saul is the man who set the stage for the Golden Age. Against all odds, he managed to form an alliance out of divergent, often mutually hostile Hebrew tribes. And he's given little credit. He ends up a tragic figure with a progressive disappearance from the biblical record. In fact, almost all the stories about Saul in 1 Samuel are in reality stories about David, whose steady rise to the throne is always in view. Chronicles has one story about Saul. He appears only in the 10th chapter, 1 Chronicles, and that's the story of his ignoble death at his own hand, and then a summary of Saul's unfaithfulness. According to that summary judgment in 1 Chronicles 10. Oh, I should say Psalm 78, which is a recitation of all of his great deeds of Israel. Saul's omitted altogether, as he is in the New Testament. He doesn't appear anyplace. According to the summary judgment in 1 Chronicles 10, Saul died for his unfaithfulness, namely his consultation of a medium, the witch of Endor, rather than seeking guidance from the Lord. What is obvious from the record is that Saul's sovereignty ran afoul of the religious authorities of his day. There's a clash between the old and the new orders, and that can be seen in Saul's opposition and quarrels with Samuel. Now, Saul's own religion, like most of the Hebrews of his day, was a combination of Canaanite and Israelite elements. At least one of his children, Ishbaal, who succeeded his father tried to succeed his father to the throne, had a theophoric name honoring the Canaanite god Baal. His name literally means man of Baal. Later writers substituted Ishbosheth, son of Shem. Saul's turning to necromancy, that conjuring up the deceased Samuel the night before the fateful battle on Mount Gilboa, is taken as a sign of religious apostasy. It was probably a product of a deranged mind and his fear of impending disaster. And this disaster, which ended Saul's reign, appeared thereafter, at least until David gained a good grip, it appeared to give the Philistines undisputed sway over the region. Many historians are unduly harsh, I think, in their evaluations of Saul, failing to take into account what is quite obviously an anti-Saul sentiment that runs through 1 Samuel. They also need to remember the situation in Canaan after Saul compared to what obtained before. Prior to his ascension, the Hebrew tribes were at best loosely related to one another through their religious loyalty to the shrine at Shiloh, where each tribe undertook to maintain that shrine for a given month. They call that a tribal amphictyony, amphictyony meaning gather together about a shrine. And it goes back to the last days of Joshua at Shechem, later named Shiloh. Only when immediate self-interest was directly threatened did one Israelite group join with another for concerted action. Such was a situation repeatedly depicted in the book of Judges, especially in their dealings with the Philistines. And at no time was there a viable unity enabling the Hebrews to act out in force over a common interest. It was Saul who was able to bring people together and wield them, however tentatively, into a political and military whole. This was one of his two major accomplishments. The other was the establishment of a monarchy in Israel. The series of events that brought Saul to power are not altogether clear. As a result of the Battle of Ebenezer, I think you can see Ebenezer right there, forgive my shakiness, in the middle of the 11th century, the area came under increasing Philistine pressure. Now, in history, there are three battles of Ebenezer. The Philistines won the first two and Israel the third. But this battle ended with a decisive Philistine victory over the Israelite tribal league, and by that I don't mean 12 tribes all banding together, but a northern league of some of the tribes. Shiloh, the center of the tribal league, was destroyed. And it was looked back upon by the prophet Jeremiah as an historical example of God's wrath on the wickedness of the people. So with the symbol of Israelite unity in ruins, the Philistines moved in to ensure tranquility. They established military garrisons at new places in the highlands. Remember, the highlands is the area on both sides of the Jordan River. Incidentally, that is the Jordan River, the Dead Sea is about the lowest point on earth in terms of elevation. So but the highlands is as I said, was largely where the Hebrews were located. Shiloh became, the place served by Samuel at that time, became the seat of the Philistine governor, not 3 miles away from Saul's hometown. No, I lost it. I can't get my light back. There it is. At Gibeah, right there. In addition to the presence of soldiers, the Philistines exacted levies and imposed prohibitions. The most serious of the prohibitions was the prohibition against smiths. No smiths were allowed among the Hebrews. The Israelites, the record says, was required to bring their farm implements to Philistine smiths for sharpening and were charged exorbitant prices for this service. However, the archaeological discovery of iron plowshares in the ruins of Saul's fortress at Gibeah suggests that Saul may have broken that iron monopoly. Now, 1 Samuel contains 2 stories of the anointing of Saul. The first story has Saul out searching for his father's donkeys, runs into a young lad who advises him to seek out this holy man, Samuel, and finds himself anointed after an elaborate screening process, prince over Israel, and presented to the people as such. The second account, in the very next chapter, indicates that Saul was proclaimed king at the ancient shrine of Gilgal. Now, it's not on the map here, but it's right at the top of the Dead Sea. By Jericho and Gilgal are missing, but that's where they are. And this is where Samuel was serving at the time. Anyway, at the ancient shrine at Gilgal, after his successful campaign to deliver Jabesh Gilead, right there, from an Ammonite siege. The accounts vary from early and late source, reflecting both pro-monarchical and anti-monarchical views. At any rate, Saul's first military action was not in Canaan against the Philistines, but in Transjordan against the Ammonites. You can see where Ammon is located there. And I pointed out Jabesh Gilead up there, south of the Sea of Galilee. Nahash of Ammon, maybe you'll recall this story, laid siege to Jabesh Gilead and offered impossible terms for sparing the city. Namely, that each citizen had to subscribe to having his or her right eye gouged out. The inhabitants, some of whom had affinities with the Benjamites to the south a little bit, stalled for time while they sought for aid. Saul rose to the occasion and led rescuing forces, striking surprisingly and decisively, generally slaughtering those Ammonites. And from this victory, the conquering hero proceeded southward to Gilgal, where he was made king before the Lord. Now remember, Gilgal, there had been a Philistine garrison as well, so there must have been some skirmishing that's not reported in the Bible for him to assume that position at that place. Well, why would the Philistines, wary of allowing those Hebrews to arm themselves, remember the prohibition against smiths, why would they allow Saul to raise an army and conduct a military campaign? Did Saul move too swiftly? Did he proceed in secret? Were these Hebrew tribes in the area a vassal, similar to David in later times? Some have even suggested perhaps that he was encouraged by the Philistines so that the Hebrews would turn their attention to the east side of the Jordan and leave the west alone. Whatever the Philistine attitude, the Hebrew attack led by Jonathan on a Philistine garrison at Gibeah, right by, it isn't on the map here, but it's by Gibeah. Where was I? Okay, the Philistine garrison at Geba and its capture set the sword between Israelite and Philistine. The struggle for supremacy in Canaan had long been building, but was now joined in earnest. Hoping to crush the growing strength of Saul before it got consolidated, the Philistines moved in force into the Central Highlands, Israelite territory. It got the upper hand early on, but then, led again by the daring Jonathan, who gave the impetus, the Hebrews under Saul were able to drive them back out of the highlands. And thereafter, for a time, Saul maintained a relatively free hand in controlling the Hebrew tribes on both sides of the Jordan in the highlands. Of course, he fought continually with non-Hebrew peoples in Transjordan to the east and with the Philistines in the west. A basic outline of this, along with some highlights, takes up really the whole 14th chapter of 1 Samuel, but it ends with this summary. When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zohar, against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. He did valiantly and struck down the Amalekites and rescued Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong or valiant warrior, he took him into his service. So he's conscripting soldiers along the way. We have very few details about the Transjordan wars. But from the Philistine wars comes one of the most widely known stories in history, and it took place in the valley of Elah by Azekah. This thing is stubborn, it won't work. Oh, there it is. Azekah, right in that area. You know the story from 1 Samuel 17, where the scrappy young David took on the Philistine giant, Goliath of Gath, and prevailed. Struggles along the borders were a fact of life for Saul. Yet from non-Hebrew enclaves near Jebus and Beth-shan, he ruled apparently peacefully, Beth-shan's right there, for most of the time when the Philistines weren't breathing down his neck. A kingdom that ran from Mount Hermon to the north, which is above Lake Hula, is that little lake up there, to Beersheba in the south, right down here. To the west, the foothills were his limits, just the other side of the highlands, the west of the highlands, we move into the foothills, while in the east he held much of the Transjordanian heights. While it's maybe possible to draw lines on the map to indicate the extent of Saul's kingdom, these lines don't tell very much about the situation in the country. In fact, the Hebrews continued to dwell mainly in the hill country, while large Canaanite populations predominated the cities and lowlands. Philistine power checked in the central highlands dominated in the great valleys along the western part. And it was really Saul's effort to end this dominion that cost him his life. Saul made his hometown of Gibeah his administrative center and built there, or found and built on, a crude palace fortress. You see where Gibeah is there, right there. Gibeah is now part of northern Jerusalem and has been the site of some important archaeological work, some of which has revealed sections of walls and the tower of that fortress. The actual dimensions of the fortress is subject to debate, but whatever it was by royal standards of the day a poor showing. Like Saul himself, a symbol of transition. And also like Saul himself, monumental in the promise it embodied. Here in stone was proof of the unity of Israel. Here was a king, here was a monarchy. The historic differences between north and southern tribes were handled well enough, better it seems, than either David or Solomon were able to do. And that goes back centuries, the northern tribes and animosity toward the southern tribe. Well, really tribe, Judah, and sometimes Benjamin. Judah, which favored David over Saul's son Ishmael after Saul's death, seems to have been firmly in the grasp of Saul. Saul was a Benjamite, you may remember. Even David, made an outlaw and a fugitive by Saul's jealousy, could not find safety among the Judahites, his own tribe, and was forced to flee to the land of the Philistines. As Saul moved north now to prevent the Philistines from cutting his kingdom in half, and they had taken Bethshan by this time, and to relieve Bethshan from their hands, he could not rejoice in his considerable accomplishments. He'd made the beginnings of a nation. Not many could have done better, and probably few could have done as well. Well, he fell with 3 of his sons at Mount Gilboa, and the Philistines hung their headless bodies on the city walls of Bethshan for all there to gaze upon with triumphant scorn. Saul and Jonathan, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, were dead. In time, the biblical writers would strip them of their honor and later omit them altogether in the recitation of the mighty deeds of Israel. We have one summary statement I should read. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men set out and traveled all night long and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. They came to Jabesh and burned them there. Then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. And that is the end of Saul. Now, this might be a good time to entertain some discussion. Not that I have vast wells of expertise, but can you kind of get a sense of Saul? And, well, let's move along then. David is a longer story, and I'll make a beginning today. I didn't know if I'd get this far, but it's difficult to get an accurate picture of David and his kingdom. The throne of David is a phrase full of meaning for Christians and Jews. Already in the time of Jeremiah, the idea of the throne and kingship of David was being transformed from a temporal earthly quality to a more abstract definition in such terms as justice and righteousness. And by the time of the writing of 1 Chronicles, the process of transformation of David from a person to a religious symbol was complete. When I was in grad school and we were going to take up 1 Chronicles, we moved out of the classroom and all went over to the Joseph Bond Chapel. This is the University of Chicago, with beautiful carved oak and stained glass windows, because the professor wanted to make a point that Chronicles was a history in stained glass. And you'll see what I mean. You compared with 2 Samuel 9, chapters 9 through 22, the so-called court history, the portrayal of David in 1 Chronicles 11 through 29 indicates that David, a tremendously complicated personality, capable of opposite extremes of emotion and action, had become more or less a one-dimensional individual, a spotless, holy king in the Chronicles. The chronicler makes no mention of Bathsheba, much less the premeditated murder of her husband. David's failure as a father in his own house and his shameful treatment of the loyal Joab, his nephew, are things forgotten. Where Saul had failed, David made a workable relationship, a workable marriage, really, between religion and state. Where Solomon introduced foreign gods into Jerusalem and built temples in their honor, David was faithful only to the God of the Hebrews. Now, David's great friend, Jonathan, the crown prince of Israel, fell with his father at Gilboa. Ishbaal, the next son in line, supported and probably manipulated by Abner, Saul's first cousin and commander of his army, established the throne at Mahanaim, right there. Come on, hold still. There we got it. Mahanaim. The Philistines had taken steps by then to make Saul's capital at Gibeah unsafe for Hebrew leadership. So he moved to Mahanaim. Mahanaim's location in Transjordan offered Ishmael two immediate advantages. It removed him from the sphere of Philistine power, and it was situated well enough to maintain effective communication with the Hebrew tribes on both sides in the highlands, both sides of the Jordan. From there, Ishmael could hope to recoup his father's losses while holding together the hard-won Hebrew federation. But he'd reckoned without David. In Saul's administration, the 12 tribes were realigned into 6 administrative regions, probably in hopes of watering down fierce tribal loyalties and competitive interests. The 5 regions to the north accepted this son of Saul, Ishmael, as the rightful ruler. Judah, the 6th region in the south, sided with David. While Saul lived, David wisely made no attempt to seize the throne. Driven from his native Judah by Saul's relentless efforts to kill him, David allied himself as a vassal to Achish, king of Gath. Remember the name Gath? That's where Goliath was from, right? So now David's aligned as a vassal to the king of Gath, who welcomed him and David's 600 loyal retainers and established them at Ziklag, right there. And from that base, David could serve his new master by keeping the Amalekites and other troublesome peoples in check. This arrangement gave him the opportunity to serve his own interests as well. By deceit, by outright lying, and by slaughter of these troublesome peoples, he was able to conceal from Achish his ingratiating activities with the Judahites, who were supposed to be numbered among his victims. So trusting was Achish that when he moved northward with other Philistines to confront Saul up there in Gilboa, he insisted upon David and his men coming to fight at his side. It was only the objections of the other Philistine commanders who weren't so trusting of David that spared him from being in the impossible position of warring against, in David's words, the Lord's anointed. So David and his men were sent back home to Ziklag. Problem: the Amalekites had raided Ziklag in David's absence, carrying off everything, including the women and children. David responded immediately and overtook them in slaughtering them and recapturing all that they had taken, plus ample additional spoil from them. But he was careful to send part of the spoils of the battle to his friends, the elders of Judah. Well, after a year in exile, David's time had come. Saul was dead. A weak successor, dominated by an ambitious relative, Abner, was attempting to rule from an undistinguished city, Mahanaim, surrounded by a tribe, Gad, of questionable loyalty. David, with his family and his retainers, returned to Judah then and came to Hebron. Hebron north, right there, not so far from Ziklag. Came to Hebron, a city whose loyalty he had carefully courted. And there the men of Judah came and anointed him king. Now, whether or not David knew that Ishbaal had set up court in Mahanaim is questionable. It's even possible that David became king before that happened. At any rate, David dropped broad hints that others besides the Judahites might recognize him as king as well. Now, in terms of archaeology and history, Hebron is one of the most important sites in Palestine. Still, David's royal city was really a small and rude place. But secure in Hebron, with the Philistines still regarding him as a faithful vassal, David moved against Ishbaal. It began with an incident that's not altogether clear, but with far-reaching implications for some time to come. 8 miles north and slightly west of Jerusalem, at Gibeon, the forces of David and those of Ishbaal met for the first time, perhaps by design, perhaps by accident. Up to this point, there had been no bloodshed between the two rivals for the throne. It was agreed that the main groups would sit on either side of the great pool at Gibeon, while 12 men of Benjamin engaged 12 of David's retainers. And the rest would sort of sit in the bleachers on either side of the pool. Whether or not this was intended to be mortal combat was not known. But what happened is clear enough. Almost at once, a full-scale military engagement, or riot, broke out. David's forces prevailed. Abner was able to regroup his men and implored Joab to call off his fighters before the two sides devoured each other completely. Now, Abner and Joab is David's commander and nephew, and Abner is Saul's cousin. They had some bad blood between them because Joab's forces had killed Abner's brother in battle. Now, was he out to get revenge? We don't know. Josephus suggests that he forgave Joab, and that later it was another issue that caused him to rise up and kill him against Abner.
Steve?
Yeah.
Is Saul still alive at this point?
No.
Okay. Is this Saul's other son besides David?
Ishbaal. Ishbaal is the one that's alive. The 3 of Saul's sons died at Mount Gilboa, and Ishbaal is the remaining one, the next one in line. We don't really know how many sons Saul had in total. But despite Abner's repeated pleas for truce, Joab pays no heed to this. And the result was a blood feud between these two generals, which finally ended with Abner's death through Joab's treachery. The riot at Gibeon was only a preview of things to come. As the war dragged on, the summary says that Ishmael's forces grew weaker while David's forces grew stronger. How long that covered, we're not sure. Then Abner, who was of the royal family, made a move for the throne. He moved in on one of the late Saul's concubines. And an angry scene ensued between him and Ishmael. So Ishmael's having a fight with his own general at this point. As a result, Abner conspired with the elders of Israel to make David king in the north as well as in the south. How much of this was done surreptitiously, we don't exactly know. But Abner then came to Hebron to make arrangements with David, only to fall victim to Joab's hatred. Joab murdered him. And this murder, at a moment of delicate negotiations, and in Hebron no less, where Abner undoubtedly came under the promise of safe conduct, seriously now compromised David's chances of being crowned in the north. What is David to do? To counter this danger, David, who had been innocent in the matter, made a public show of grief, got together an elaborate funeral, and he himself appeared as the chief mourner in the funeral procession. I think that might be. How much time do we have left? I'm going a lot faster than I thought I'd. Quarter after. Oh, well, I better stop right there for now and see what other questions we might have. Yeah, Harvey.
Are the Palestinians today the descendants of the Philistines?
The name comes from Philistines, but how many of them are descendants? That would be hard to tell with all the amalgamation of people. We'll see later that as David subdues all the other enemies, the Canaanites are just sort of absorbed. And the Philistines at one point, we'll see next week, were reduced to where they weren't really a factor anymore. But all I know is that the word Palestine is a derivative from the word Philistine. Others? Yeah, Kit. It's not on.
Nella, which handheld are you using? Is it 1 or 2? Go ahead and try now.
Try it now.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, good. Steve, I have a couple of map questions for you. I always like it when speakers provide a map because it gives you all kinds of hints or maybe misleading hints. I'm just wondering, you mentioned the Ammonites, and I'm noticing that's up there in Transjordan. Would that be a word that became the capital of Jordan because it's Amman? Is that how the connection is there?
That never occurred to me. I don't know the name Amman. I've been there, but I don't know where that name comes from. If that's an Ammonite derivative or not, I don't know. Could be.
It could be. A couple of the other towns that you mentioned, Hebron and Shiloh, are names of towns in our own country. And would those names have been used for some of our villages because of what happened early on in the original Hebrons or original Shilohs. Do you know about that?
That would be hard to sort out. You know,
Okay.
how many of them had Canaanite origins to the
Okay.
town? You know, whether the Hebrews just use it. The only one I know, we think, we're not even sure that Shiloh was formerly Shechem. They were real close to each other, so that could have been, that's been suggested. But other than that, I don't know how much the Israelites, now sometimes, you know, like wherever you see the word Beth, that means house in Hebrew, you know. But Semitic languages, I don't know that well to say what town names they kept and which ones they changed. I don't know.
Thank you.
I was wondering about the name Saul. You said that there was great obscurity and a kind of a hiding of his kingship later on in the Kings and Chronicles. But the Apostle Paul used to be called Saul. So was
Yeah.
there a continuation still of a memory of the king of Saul, or it's still a popular
It's
name
interesting
today,
because
S-O-L?
the Apostle Paul, Saul,
Yes.
was also a Benjamite.
Yeah.
It says in Philippians, I think 3 or 4. What does it say, Bob? Didn't it say he was from the tribe of Benjamin? Yeah, in there. Yeah, so it could be that that's the namesake relationship. Could well be. I don't know how common the name became, but yeah.
I think there are lots of, Jewish men who are called Saul, S-O-L,
Yeah.
today, so it continues.
Yeah, still use the name, yeah. From time to time, yeah. Anyone else? It's kind of dizzying a little bit to try and follow this, isn't it? Yeah. That's why I need to stick right with my notes, because it's confusing to me too. And sifting through all this stuff as I was preparing over weeks to kind of get this down is a real challenge. But like I say, I hope we will walk away after with a solid impression of how things operate. And that these figures are just complicated people. And all three of them operate from mixed motives. And some of them out of national self-interest and some of it out of personal self-interest. But they were very complex people. That's why I say First Chronicles sort of whitewashes David. We'll see. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah.
We look forward to more of David.
Yeah, we'll
next
take
week.
up David again next week.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I'll try and go slower. I didn't know it was going to take this long.